The missing Haas. A Roman crucifixion was designed to be the absolute end of a story. It was not merely a method of execution, but a tool of total erasure. When Jesus of Nazareth breathed his last on a Friday afternoon in first-century Judea, the Roman authorities and the local religious leaders assumed the movement was permanently finished. But the physical death of Jesus did not bring silence. Instead, it triggered a chaotic and mysterious sequence of events over the next 48 hours. What really happened between the Friday afternoon of the crucifixion and the dawn of Sunday morning? To understand the mystery of those missing hours, we must first look at a highly unusual intervention. Under normal Roman custom, the victims of crucifixion were denied proper burial. Their bodies were typically left on the crosses for scavengers, or discarded in unmarked communal trenches. It was a final humiliation meant to strip the victim of all dignity and memory. But the Gospel accounts record that this did not happen to Jesus. A man named Joseph of Arimathea stepped forward. According to the texts, Joseph was a wealthy man and a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the very same religious council that had sought the execution. Approaching the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to ask for the body of a crucified man was an act of immense political and personal risk. If Joseph had remained silent, Jesus would likely have been thrown into a common grave, making any future claim of an empty tomb impossible to verify. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion was a slow agony that could last for days. After a Roman centurion confirmed the death, Pilate released the body. At this point, another secretive figure emerged. The Gospel of John mentions Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had previously visited Jesus under the cover of darkness. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 75 pounds. This was an astonishing amount of burial spices, a quantity typically reserved for the burial of royalty. Because the Jewish Sabbath was rapidly approaching at sunset, the burial had to be rushed. The men hastily washed the body, wrapped it in linen cloths with the spices, and placed it in a newly carved tomb nearby. A massive stone was rolled across the entrance. Physically and legally, the matter seemed closed. But the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, describes a series of violent disruptions that accompanied this death. The text records that from noon until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. When Jesus died, the massive veil in the temple in Jerusalem was torn in two from top to bottom. An earthquake shook the ground, splitting rocks apart. And then, Matthew includes one of the most debated and mysterious passages in the entire New Testament. The text claims that tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. It says they came out of the tombs after the resurrection of Jesus and went into the holy city, appearing to many people. This strange detail is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. For centuries, scholars have debated how to interpret this moment. Some early Christian writers understood it as a literal, historical event, a physical demonstration of death being conquered. Many modern biblical historians suggest it should be read as apocalyptic symbolism, a theological way of saying that the death of Jesus shattered the boundary between the living and the dead. Regardless of how one interprets the earthquake and the rising saints, the religious leaders were deeply unsettled. They remembered a prophecy that Jesus would rise after 3 days. Fearing that the disciples might steal the body and stage a miracle, they went back to Pilate. They requested that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. Pilate granted them a detachment of soldiers. They went to the tomb, placed an official Roman seal on the stone, and set a heavy guard. Breaking a Roman seal was an offense punishable by death. The tomb was now a heavily guarded fortress. While the Roman soldiers kept watch outside, the inner circle of Jesus was entirely broken. The men who had promised to follow him to the death had scattered in terror. Peter had denied knowing him. John had watched the execution from a distance. They were hiding behind locked doors, paralyzed by fear and grief, convinced that their movement had ended in total failure. But while the physical body of Jesus lay wrapped in darkness behind a sealed stone, the earliest Christian traditions suggest that the real narrative had shifted to an entirely different realm. According to letters written just decades later, the spirit of Jesus was not merely resting in the silence of the grave. Continuo para proxima part dois. The first epistle of Peter contains one of the most enigmatic passages in the entire New Testament. Written perhaps 30 years after the crucifixion, the text claims that Jesus was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. It then adds a strange detail, stating that in this spiritual state, he went and made a proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. For early Christians, this was not just a mysterious metaphor. It formed the basis of a profound theological concept later known as the harrowing of hell. According to this early tradition, the period between Friday afternoon and Sunday morning was not a time of defeat or passive waiting. Instead, it was viewed as a cosmic invasion. The earliest believers understood the ancient concept of the underworld, known in Hebrew as Sheol and in Greek as Hades, as a cold, shadowy holding place for all the dead. They believed that the Spirit of Jesus descended into this realm, shattered the gates of bronze, and liberated the righteous souls who had been waiting since the dawn of time. While this dramatic rescue mission became a central piece of later Christian art and doctrine, it stands in stark contrast to the physical reality happening above ground in Jerusalem. Back in the city, the Saturday Sabbath was a day of agonizing silence and crushing despair. The disciples were entirely paralyzed. They had believed Jesus of Nazareth was the promised Messiah who would liberate Israel from Roman occupation and restore the kingdom. His death on a Roman cross was not just a political tragedy, it was a theological catastrophe. In the first century Jewish mindset, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. A true deliverer was supposed to defeat the enemies of Israel, not be publicly executed by them. But as the Sabbath ended at sundown on Saturday evening, a small group of women began preparing to visit the tomb. The Gospel of Mark specifically names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome among them. They bought additional spices to properly anoint the body, a final act of devotion that had been rushed on Friday afternoon. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, they made their way toward the burial site. Their primary concern, according to the text, was purely practical. They were asking each other who would roll away the massive stone from the entrance of the tomb. What happens next is recorded in all four Gospels, though with varying details that historians have debated for centuries. When the women arrived at the site, the heavy stone had already been moved. The tomb was completely open. Matthew chapter 28 records that another violent earthquake had struck the area, and an angel of the Lord had descended to roll back the stone, sitting upon it. The Roman guards, hardened soldiers placed there to secure the official seal, were reportedly so terrified that they shook and became like dead men. The women entered the tomb, expecting to find the battered corpse of their teacher. Instead, they found the burial linens lying empty. The body was gone. From a purely historical and investigative perspective, this moment introduces one of the strongest arguments for the authenticity of the empty tomb tradition. In the highly patriarchal culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, the testimony of women was widely considered unreliable and was generally not accepted in legal proceedings. If the early Christians were simply inventing a heroic myth to convince the Roman and Jewish authorities, they would have written Peter or John as the heroic first discoverers. Choosing a group of grieving women, particularly Mary Magdalene, as the primary witnesses to the central event of the Christian faith is what historians call the criterion of embarrassment. It is a detail so culturally inconvenient that it is highly unlikely to have been deliberately fabricated. The inclusion of their testimony strongly suggests that the earliest writers were bound by a historical memory they could not simply alter to fit the expectations of their society. But an empty tomb, by itself, did not prove a miraculous resurrection. When Mary Magdalene saw the missing body, her initial reaction was not joy or triumph. According to the Gospel of John, she immediately ran to find Peter and told him that someone had taken the Lord out of the tomb and they did not know where they had put him. Grave robbery was a common crime in the ancient world, so common that Roman authorities eventually issued strict decrees against disturbing burial sites. For the broken disciples, a stolen body was the most logical and devastating conclusion. The guards who had been stationed at the tomb also faced a terrifying reality. They had failed in their absolute duty to secure the Roman seal. Knowing that sleeping on watch or abandoning a post carried the death penalty, they fled the cemetery and returned to the city, setting the stage for a massive cover-up. Continuo para proxima parte tres. When the terrified Roman guards fled the cemetery, they did not go to Pontius Pilate. They went directly to the chief priests. According to the Gospel of Matthew, a secret meeting of the religious elders was quickly convened. Realizing the disaster they were facing, the leaders gave the soldiers a large sum of money. They instructed the guards to say that the disciples of Jesus came during the night and stole his body while they were sleeping. This claim became the very first alternative explanation for the empty tomb. It circulated widely in the first century. But from a historical and investigative perspective, the stolen body theory presents massive psychological problems. The disciples were hiding behind locked doors, utterly paralyzed by fear. The idea that this terrified group of fishermen suddenly overpowered a heavy detachment of Roman guards, moved a massive stone in complete silence, and stole a corpse to fabricate a myth contradicts everything we know about their state of mind. Furthermore, history shows that people rarely choose to be tortured and executed for a lie they invented themselves. Over the centuries, other hypotheses have emerged to explain the mysterious events of that Sunday morning. One popular modern claim, often called the swoon theory, suggests that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. Instead, he simply passed out from severe exhaustion and blood loss, awoke in the cool dampness of the tomb, rolled away the stone himself, and appeared to his followers. However, medical experts and historians universally reject this idea. Roman executioners were professional killers. Breaking their own protocols and failing to confirm a death carried severe penalties. A spear thrust into the side of Jesus, producing blood and water, is recognized as a medically accurate description of heart failure and fluid buildup around the lungs. A man brutally tortured, crucified, and pierced through the chest could not survive 3 days without medical care, let alone push aside a heavy stone and convince his followers he had triumphantly conquered death. Another interpretation argues that the disciples experienced profound grief hallucinations. In their desperate state of mourning, they convinced themselves they saw Jesus alive. While grief hallucinations are a documented psychological phenomenon, they are almost always individual, internal experiences. The New Testament records that Jesus appeared to groups of people simultaneously, sometimes outdoors, sometimes indoors, eating food and allowing himself to be touched. More importantly, hallucination theories cannot explain the missing body. If the disciples were merely hallucinating, the Roman and Jewish authorities could have simply opened the tomb and produced the corpse, instantly crushing the new movement. It is also vital to remember that the disciples were not primed to expect a resurrection. When the first reports of the empty tomb began to circulate, the inner circle did not immediately believe it. The Gospel of John specifically highlights the skepticism of Thomas. He explicitly refused to believe the testimony of the women, demanding physical, empirical proof, and stating he needed to touch the wounds himself. This inclusion of profound doubt among the earliest believers strongly argues against the idea that they were expecting a miracle. The claim they eventually made was completely unique in the ancient world. They did not claim Jesus had been resuscitated to ordinary life, only to die again later. They claimed he had entered a new, glorified form of physical existence. This concept was deeply alien to both the Greek worldview, which saw the physical body as a prison for the soul, and the traditional Jewish expectation, which anticipated a general resurrection of all people at the end of time, not one man rising in the middle of history. When modern historians examine the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion, they generally agree on three established facts. First, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Second, his tomb was discovered empty by a group of his female followers. Third, his disciples sincerely believed that he appeared to them alive. Historical evidence cannot scientifically prove a supernatural event, but the evidence resists every simple naturalistic explanation proposed over the last 2,000 years. The 48 hours after the crucifixion were supposed to be a silent fade into historical oblivion. A Roman cross was designed to erase a name from the earth forever. Instead, the events of that weekend ignited a movement that outlasted the Roman Empire and reshaped human history. The empty tomb remains the great enduring mystery of the ancient world. But what happened to those terrified disciples next? How did they carry this message to the ends of the earth, and what kind of deaths did they eventually face for their testimony? If you would like our next investigation to examine the mysterious fates of the 12 apostles, leave the word apostles in the comments.